Tifiwe Dombo, who is the HR Transformation Advisor at SAP EMA. So good to have both of you. Let's have our seats. So nice to see you, Washington.
Sure.
That's fine. Have a seat over
Thank
there.
Thanks. Do we sit anywhere?
Wherever you want, doesn't matter. If you have a seat,
Where
I'm going to
you
go and
gonna
grab the seat over here.
Yeah.
So there we go. I'll come and sit next to you.
Good to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Nice to see you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us.
Morning.
Loving how he's starting everything off, because, you know, this is a discussion I think that a lot of people are worried about, you know, in every industry. So it'll be quite interesting to see where we go in terms of HR. So Washington, if I can actually begin with you as you sit over there. So what are you seeing as the most significant HR technology trends that are currently shaping the industry? And I mean, I imagine just putting our cap on and looking into the future, what does it look like?
Look, I think the one thing we as Sage undertook a bit of research, obviously, to continuously understand the market that we serve. And what we've established is, yes, tech is definitely there, but I think if you take it back more to trying to be human and understanding it, what we've picked up is that definitely change is inevitable, and I think a lot of HR professionals are seeing that there's a constant change that's happening. A lot of it was largely driven from the time when we started with COVID. I think before that, HR kind of sat at the back of the scene, but during the COVID era, suddenly they came to the forefront. So when you look at technology in its own right, you're seeing a lot of more focus around how do you better serve your single biggest asset, which is people. And what we've seen is, even with AI and everything coming forward, a lot of workflow automation has come into the play, because now enabling the whole remote work that you need to be able to do. So you're finding that there's a lot of focus in the tech space around the employee experience, because it's more than just paying the employee. How do you build that whole experience, but how do you also look at talent management? I think that's that's another trend that's coming through. Talent management is just beyond just recruiting. It's more of how do you retain. A lot of organizations are in a scenario where you're dealing with a different, probably more than one set of generational employees. You've got your baby boomers all the way through to the Gen Z. Now, even just how you manage those has become very different. I mean, baby boomers want to consume a lot of information, but when you look at your Gen Z, they don't consume a lot of information. They want snippets, and if they're not engaged within the first 2, 3, 5 seconds, they're gone. I mean, that's why you see the likes of TikTok and everyone else. So again, that's changing again in terms of how do you even communicate in an organization. Does a 10-page email or 20-page document actually speak to them? So you're seeing that there's a lot of those changes that are coming through. But even when you look at also analysis, a lot of predictive analysis is coming in. That's also another trend. How can I get more information about my workforce? What can I use that data to actually start making strategic decisions? I mean, if you think of the change that's happening now, going forward, what type of workforce will you need in 5, 10 years' time? And if you better understand that, come back and say, what do I need to start doing now to actually build on that workforce, so that, you're not worried about, am I going to have redundant employees? So we all talk about AI, but AI is there to serve the humans, and until it starts serving itself, there is a need for us in this.
Yeah. Love that. I mean, it's important, but I think that's the question we need to look at, is that what does it look like in 10 years' time, and how do we get ourselves ready? Because that I think is what I hope we're hoping to achieve out of this gathering and some of the ideas. And we'll come back to that, Washington. Yeah. But I want to throw the same question to you, Tifiwe, as well. Basically what Washington was saying, I don't know if you want to add anything into those opening remarks.
Yeah, it's similar trends that we see.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the things to highlight, we are beginning to see a lot of the extended workforce. You spoke about freelancers when you opened. They are now beginning to be incorporated into the main workforce, because the objectives that we have as a business, they contribute a lot in terms of achieving those objectives. So we're beginning to see this concept of the total workforce management. You've got students that you are bringing in maybe for 2 or 3 years, then you let them go somewhere else. You've got your main workforce. You've got contractors that you bring in for specialized skills, for those short-term engagement. The fact that they come in to help you achieve business objectives means that there are services that they need to consume from HR. And there's an experience that we need to create for them as HR, because if we need their skills in later, we need to be able to call on them and they should think, oh, I can go back, instead of thinking, well, the treatment was not so good. So, over and above what Washington was saying, there's that element of who's my workforce? Is it just the users that I have, the employees that I have? Who else do I have that help me to achieve my business objectives?
Yeah, amazing. Kivesh, from here, and
Look, I think the one thing that we're seeing is, and I agree with both gentlemen as well, is there's a definite shift between a job economy to a skills economy. So there's a lot of South Africans who are possibly employed and unemployed that have qualifications and possibly don't. But do they have skills? Yes, they do. And what we're seeing is a shift in terms of the job economy going to the skills economy, where companies are actually hiring based on skills. So they're changing the way they hire based on the previous ways of looking at a job description, a specific type, a specific grade, and that's taking place. I think just to touch into what Chike was saying as well, is a lot of organizations are also thinking about understanding their workforce better, and knowing the skills they have to think about how do we pivot the teams we have. So if we're creating a new team, a new division, a new structure, embarking on a new strategy, how do we leverage the skills that we have today and almost give them a gig within the organization to legitimize something that they could be passionate about. And that's a definite trend we're seeing in South Africa based on the companies that we consult to.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, I was telling you, I was listening to this podcast on my way here, to sound like an expert in HR, but it was interesting to hear because it's experts that such as yourselves, and one of the individuals on this panel was actually saying how as companies you constantly do monitoring and data analysis and the reading up on what the customer wants and what your client wants, but what does your staff want? And that's something that has been sort of almost lacking in a while, actually looking at saying, okay, hang on to the client for a second, what do our staff want? What do they want different? And I think in this day and age, people want very different work environments to what the traditional work environment looked like. So Washington, let me come back to you because I'm hoping each of us can weigh into this from looking at some of the ethical considerations that are going into how the workforce is changing, AI, which is massive, and I know all of you have spoken to it, but perhaps we can speak a bit more about that, and performance management from our staff. What are we looking at in this new era of HR?
Look, I think what we're seeing, and I'll speak more from the Sage perspective, and also as someone who manages a team of people, is that you cannot just do a one-size-fits-all. I think we spoke about the fact that the gig economy has become quite important. So you're finding that a lot of employees now, even more the younger generation, is not really looking for that long-term employment. Right? They are more around, listen, give me a gig for 6 months, a year, I want to move on, I can go and work in the UK, I can work in Japan or wherever, do something else and keep moving on. Now, is our structures and processes and policies within organizations suited to actually accommodate that? And that is something that a lot of HR professionals are being faced with. But when you start looking at it in terms of, again, that employee experience, because I think that's really where a lot of it is centered. Because now, how do you get those people involved? So talent acquisition becomes important. Like you mentioned earlier, people are not only, it's not just about the job, it's about what the skill set that you need. Now, how do I start to go out and understand that the skill set that I need, perhaps I actually don't need it to be, a full-time employee? How do I then acquire that skill set? And what sort of, how do I make it attractive for them to actually, want to work with me? So, as much as we appreciate that we've got unemployment challenges and people need to look for jobs, but there's actually people now that you almost have to market to them to say, listen, come and work for us. Now, what is it that appeals to those individuals? Again, you look at some of the tech, like if you're speaking in AI, how do you start to identify your skills gaps even within your own organization? How much gap do you have? Yes, you might have a full complement of employees, but is that addressing the skills gaps that you need to come and bring it in? And then when you also look at it into some of the AI stuff, so even the analytics, I think a lot of times we talk about the analytics, but I still believe that companies generate a lot of data which is hardly used. Right? So the information is there, but what are we actually doing with it to then be able to make those informed decisions that we need to be taking? So I do see it as sometimes we talk about we need to undergo a very massive transformation, but really it's just about understanding what you need. So even if you decide that you want to go into a new system, what information do you really need? How much of it do you already not have, and why are you wanting to do that change in there?
It is fascinating. We are living in a fascinating world, and this generation that's coming into the workforce is a completely different mindset, as I think all of us have been saying. Yeah, give me 6 months, I'm cool with that. I'm going to be moving somewhere else, or yes, I'll work for you, but I don't want to sit at a desk. I don't want to be traveling around. You'll get my work, and that is an important aspect of all of this. So Tigero, let's indulge a little bit more on this.
So I want to pick up on the ethical aspect that you mentioned.
Yes, that's a big thing for me.
In the question. I always say to my customers that HR has been doing big data before big data was fashionable. We always had files with information about employees. If you look in the mining sector, our customers in mining, they've got records of employees going back many, many years. There's always this concept in the mining sector about a city wife and a rural wife. The miner, sadly lose their life at work. There's a wife that will show up to come for the claims of benefits, but we always wait for the rural wife to show up. But if you check it, what we are helping customers do with systems is we are now generating all this data easily accessible. On the palm of the HR's hands, the leader's hands, and we need to have a conversation around the ethical use of that HR data. Suddenly the data that was only in the remit of HR or certain users is available to people managers to make business decisions, to lead the business and manage their people. Now, how that information is used, we then always need to have a conversation around what are the principles, the guiding principles that we need to inculcate in our users, in our employees, on how to use that HR information. The data can be used, but it comes back to the culture that we are building as an organization. So where the data ends up, we control that to the culture that we have as an organization. So through AI, we generate a lot of data. We allow employees to consume a lot of data, but we need to be able to hold our employees accountable in line with our culture on the ethical use of this HR information that is now easily accessible.
Yeah, I like that. I like where we're going with this because, Commission, perhaps you can add to this because the thing is you have got a lot of data. That's what you're all about. But what challenges do you find in the organization, or does the organization face in adopting this data-driven HR? What are these big strategies?
I think that the key thing is, and Chifu is right, the data has always been there. The challenge has never been in terms of finding the data, but to find the truth within the data.
Yes.
So we moved from a stage where data was very batch-driven, and you would payroll data or system data would take weeks and months to come in. Now we've moved to data being a lot more real-time. But honestly, it's about finding the signal in the noise. And often what I do is when we consult with the clients we speak to in South Africa, I ask them a simple question: what is your head count? Between a CEO, a CFO, and HR director, I get 3 different answers, just based on head count. And that's quite shocking because the data is there. And then we dig in deeper, and I spoke about the fact that there's so many different systems that companies use. I'll give you a simple analogy. You can take 6 Lego blocks, which is a 2x4, and if you think about how many systems organizations have today to report on data, so 6 Lego blocks, you can have 915 million permutations just based on 6 Lego blocks. So we were consulting with a bank a few days ago, and we sat across them and we looked at all the systems and all the data they had, and we asked them these simple questions: head count, do you know the talent in your organization that's probably high propensity of leaving, and had no idea. And we brought it back to just, the data's there, but how do you find that signal in the noise? How do you report off it better? And and how do you make the relevant truth to make the data-informed decisions as well.
Yeah, and I love it. Are you serious?
Yep.
6 level blocks can make how many?
915 permutations.
Well, I'm not sure I have the patience to find it out, but I'll leave the analysis to you. Let's talk a little bit, Washington, about the employee experience, because there's so much data. It's just this little chain of events that go through, and obviously we've got all of these HR technologies that are there to enhance the employee experience. Surely, that's what it's all about at the end of the day. But what role does personalization play in this evolution? Because each one of you have spoken about this, the fact that one size does not fit all, and it doesn't. So let's talk to personalization.
So if you take personalization, I think it comes down to, at a basic level, just in terms of the employees. So you will find that in a lot of setups now within your HR, and maybe I'll just take one step back. If you go back, say, 10, 15 years ago, the big focus for HR professionals was around payroll, being able to just pay employees. Right? Now, if you then move forward, what has then transpired now is that it's now more the HR side of things, the people side of things, the whole employee experience. So what's coming in now is, how do I now create that enhancement? Now, you see a lot of employee self-service capability coming into play. So how do I also, because HR can only do so much with the resources it has. So now, how do you start to spin that to say, instead of you get a queue of 20 emails of people saying, please send me my pay slip, or I need to know my leave days balance, the employee self-service now starts to allow for that. It also moves away the need for HR to do things. The manager can approve leave, and all HR needs is just to make sure that it goes through the necessary workflows. So you see that sort of change. But then you can even go beyond part of the experience, which is even looking at beyond the employment of that particular individuals. You are seeing things that, banks, for example, and financial institutions are looking at how can they better serve people. You now start to get it for you. And this is being created behind the scenes. Obviously, that now requires also a lot of ethical applications, as you have mentioned, but also data protection, because this is information that is coming through. So that whole experience now enables me as an employer to actually give my employees capability that also gives them back time. They can simply be doing the application, and all the documentation information required is quickly sent through to the bank, and they don't even physically have to go in there. So I think you are seeing the design of employee experience not just within the workplace, but it's also going outside. If you think of issues as well around employee wellness, I think mental health has become such a big thing. And now how do employers start to get involved in that and be able to provide the necessary support? So those are experiences that I think go over and above just the fact that somebody shows up to work, does what 8 to 5 and goes home.
Yeah, I'm hoping we focus a lot on wellness throughout this time, because as you say, that has become one of the most important aspects in any organization. But can we dig a little bit deeper, in terms of looking at this whole personalization? And let's talk to employees that are perhaps disabled, they have a disability, and they're not, as many of us are explaining, and at the same time, those that are also not that proficient in technology. They don't have all of these wonderful things that CEOs and the bigger earners have got. So there is huge gaps we're dealing with. So I don't know if you want to go there as well.
Yeah, let me just hop on what Washington was saying. One of the trends that we see, especially with AI, is that over and above personalization from an employee experience perspective, there's an element of augmentation. That systems need to be able to know what else I need in order to make a particular decision. So we'll automate and push the data as much as possible using self-services, but with AI, the system needs to know that you are missing 2 or 3 references to policies before you make a particular decision, and the system needs to augment how you work. So on the issue around inclusivity, I've got a colleague who's based in Saudi, totally blind, but she's got a customer-facing phone. Now, if you go back 15, 20 years back, you probably would not have heard of an employee who's totally blind but has got a customer-facing role. She does what I do. She goes to events, engages with customers. But what's quite interesting is that when we engage with her internally, knowing that she's totally blind, we know that, across the SAP and the Microsoft technology that she works on, she prefers to talk on Teams via voice instead of chatting. She can chat on Teams, but internally we know that because of her condition, how do we work with her to make sure that she can start a process using the tech, we can have an engagement and round off the process using the tech. But a lot of this goes down to the culture that we have as an organization. If the culture is not inclusive in everything else, in terms of the facilities that we have, the infrastructure that we have, from an experience perspective, we can't suddenly expect the tech to be inclusive, whereas the culture of the organization is not inclusive. So when the culture of the organization is inclusive, when we build new tools, new systems, already we build with that in mind. It doesn't become an afterthought when we are done with deploying a new application to start thinking, what are we going to do with this particular user base? On the topic of employees that might not be tech proficient, we need to lead with our language, right? What language do we use internally as an organization? And how is the tech going to support that language? Are we going to change our language completely because we're following the tech, or is the tech going to enable us to use the language that we use? So when we work with customers in retail especially, instead of talking about employees, they talk about associates. So suddenly if you deploy a new technology and you want to force the employees to suddenly start calling each other employees instead of associates, and this has got a ripple effect that as a user, and normally when we think about tech, we think everyone is an everyday user. There are occasional users in tech. We need to think about them, that if we use our language in the technology, how the technology interacts with me, how I interact with the technology, if it supports our day-to-day language as an organization, we find that it removes a lot of barriers for those employees that are occasional system users. Washington spoke about payslips. That's a very commonly used app, if we call it that, in the HR space. There are some pieces of technology that are not commonly used, such as performance management. If your organization does that 2 times or 3 times a year, but as a user, I want the comfort to know that when I access the technology, it's going to speak my language. I don't have to suddenly go and assume a new personality with a new language in order for me to use that technology. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention All Blacks in the room, but I'll mention, well, we beat them anyway over the weekend. I mean, if you look at the All Blacks, they run their HR on our platform. So, and you look at the kind of organization that they are, and we've got other customers. We have got a government asset manager that runs their HR on our technology. We have got multiple revenue authorities across the world that run HR on our technology. And these are all customers in different industries. They've got different cultures. But when we message, when the tech speaks my language, it's easy for me to use it. And I'm not even scared to go into the tech because I know that it's going to help me with my function.
Yeah, interesting, very, very interesting. All right, I want to give you one more sort of question in there, and then I want to see, please, if you've got any questions from the audience. We're heading up to 15 minutes left on the panel, so I really want to include some questions in as well. So after this one, I'm going to open up, and if you can sort of put your hands up and we'll get a microphone to you, or if you can already do that, I can already see someone running with a mic, we'll start checking that. Kev, we haven't touched on perhaps one of the biggest issues as well is remote working, and that is something I think that has been moved in very big ways, and come into the office 3 days a week and do this and do that, and some big CEOs are wanting everyone back 5 days a week. I think even there was a comment from Jeff Bezos, one of these. You can correct me, I'm not sure, but he was saying one of the biggest mistakes they made as a company was to encourage remote working, because it sort of got rid of a culture of a lot of, I suppose, togetherness in a company and good thinking. However, not many agree with that. Let's talk about that, how we handle it.
So I just want to touch on Chief Ed's point as well on
Please, carry on.
disability and tech. So very quickly, from a Workday perspective, we spend a large majority, just sub 40% of our turnover on R&D. We spend a lot of time looking at our entire workforce with our customers and how can we make Workday more accessible. So a few things that we actually do is we ensure that some of the functionality within Workday can be done without the mouse. So if somebody is physically not able to move the mouse, the other things that we're doing is if we're looking at people being visually impaired, is actually using boxes in different shapes. So if you might be, for example, colorblind, you'll still be able to navigate a Workday system by looking at the different shapes and different sizes. And we're using text-to-speech, but the last one is actually voice. That's where AI is coming in. So, most of our technology platforms allow for it, where you can apply for leave, check your pay slip, manage your team just by using voice commands on an app. We do that as well. So just want to touch on that. I think to your question, I was chatting to Avanti from HR Director from Google just before we kicked off the conference, and we were just chatting about this as well. That when we went through COVID, I think work from home and remote working became one of the biggest themes for most companies that we needed to adopt, and it almost became a prerequisite. As we move to hybrid, right now, I think the challenge that most organizations are faced with is productivity. So one is productivity, is knowing, do we know what our teams are doing, how they're doing, so are we meeting the company's goals and objectives? And then I guess the bigger question is, how do you manage that? When I chatted to our clients that went through COVID, and I asked them, what did you do differently within Workday? We got a very simple answer back, which was really humble for us. They didn't do anything. So our platform allowed our customers to know their employees, where they were, deep insights in terms of full visibility of the data, of their living conditions, doing surveys in terms of the voice of the employee, and then taking that data back. I think the adaptation needs to take place now is knowing the company's goals, the strategy of the organization, and how HR can play a role to be a lot more strategic. Yeah. Once you've got that, then you've got to take the policy and think about, okay, how do we maximize this? So coming back to one of the early questions you had, we live in a shared economy. You don't have to buy a car or have a house. You can use Airbnb and Uber, all those other good things. And because the way of work is changing, it's all about the EVP, the employee value proposition. Right. So happy employees leads to happy customers. And there's a lot of rich data that shows that the higher the employee engagement, the higher the turnover of organizations as well. So taking that in mind, we have to be able to adapt to the hybrid workforce. It is challenging. I think the biggest challenge is how do you make it equitable? Yeah. A few years ago, I wrote a dissertation on proximity bias, which has become a white paper on how do you manage a remote workforce. And some of the elements are that if you manage a team who's in the office and a team remotely, is there a view of unbiased or accidental favoritism that could also take place? So our technologies that we have collectively does play a role in terms of how we can enable that. But at the end of the day, this is where the power goes back to the human. We need to make sure that business leaders make good decisions on how to enforce these policies. We're very clear that we move away, instead of clocking somebody in and working 10 hours a week or 10 hours a day, on what is the outcome that we're expecting from them. Yeah. And if we move to be more outcome-based, and if compensation is driven around that, I think it'll drive a different type of behavior.
Yeah, I think so. I really do. I'm sure we'll get a little bit more comments on that. But I know we've got some questions from the floor, and I'm looking forward to hearing a few of them. So, first question, have we got one already? These pink lights are, ooh, yeah. I know. I'm trying to see, but I can't really see if we've got one. I can see a hand. Hi. Okay, there we go.
Thank you very much. You guys have spoken about culture, big data, transformation. What I wanted to know is, how do you integrate these technologies? There's so many technologies at the moment. AI, the impact that it's making. But how do you actually integrate? A lot of my clients have actually asked me how they want to integrate, for example, talent management with learning management systems, with customer resource management, and that sort of thing. How do you integrate this?
Anyone want to take that?
Cool. Yeah, I'll go first. I think we need to acknowledge that there needs to be a core, that manages not everything in terms of the data that is used, whether it's for employee administration, how we are structured as an organization. what skills do we need to bring in from a recruiting perspective, and how do we develop new skills in order to create the future workforce. So when that core is in place, the core is going to help us to determine what do we need to build as a base in the organization. How do we ensure that when other pieces are moving around what we are doing, the core is going to remain? And the core is not only about managing data, right? It's about being able to use that data to trigger off on the recruiting side. So if someone gets a promotion and they move to a different country in a new position, how do we know what needs to be done on the talent side? Is there any mandatory learning that they need to take on because they are moving to a new country? If someone moves from being office-based to going to work on the factory floor, what kind of learning do they need to have? So the core helps to keep that in place. So the other areas, not to say that the other areas are not important, they've got a role to play, but when there is a core that the other functions hook onto, that enables us to come and do broader reporting at the end of the day. And maybe this is a point where we need to talk about what HR needs to do, right? You know, with the tech and all the innovation that we are beginning to see, as HR, we are still responsible for building and designing the organization. You know, depending on what objectives we have, after we design those organizations, we are responsible for filling the roles if there are any vacancies. After we have onboarded the new employees, we need to ensure that they keep their skills up to date, not only for competitive advantage, sometimes for compliance purposes. And we know how to create an environment where employees can grow and they can also come and, you know, be able to share with other employees, what am I doing in terms of performance? What else can I do within the organization? So I think that core is important. Normally when we get the core right, the other functions are easier then to integrate into the core, and then we are able to have a base on which we can innovate from.
And Chifio, I completely agree. I think a lot of companies tend to look at the other functionality like recruiting or learning or performance outside of the core data, and you build these discrete systems that actually can't connect, and that leads to challenges as well. I think from my perspective is, if you look at an analogy of a house, your foundation needs to be your core HR master data. Single source of the truth, having a digital ledger of the employee, and everything from that almost becomes another room in the house. The other room could be performance management, or could be recruiting or learning, and you build on top of that. But without that foundational layer in place, you will have more complexity as you build out discrete systems and trying to get answers based on understanding your employees a bit better.
And I think what you also tend to find is sometimes the biggest pitfall is when you go out looking for the systems, you know, is getting to understand what exactly do you want to achieve from it, you know, because it may work perfectly in one setting, but it may not necessarily work in your own, in your particular setting. And we've seen this quite a lot where, to the point that's been raised, that the core is always important. I think what do we ultimately want is you want the single source of truth, right? So how does everything else feed in? Whether is it feeding in as part of, you know, integrations, you know, APIs, those conversations happen, because certain industries have particular nuances which may not necessarily be the same. So if you look at it, say, in the mining space, there might be a particular nuance that now you require specific functionality which may not necessarily be required in the others. So now you either go and customize, but you're customizing because of the fact that I have my core, which gives me everything that I need. So again, to then get that integration, I think a lot of it ends up being patchwork, right? Because you've gone out there and you were so sold on the one piece. Now you're trying to give the other functionality. So if learner management is an integral part of it, you need to understand where does it best fit in with everyone. So before you can even get to say what works for me completely, you probably have to go back a few steps, and it's in that specification and understanding. And I think across the room here, you know, we're competitors in one space, but we also see the same stuff that happens across, and you know, people hop between the two. And sometimes when you listen to the reasons why customers are either hopping from one to the other, it's because you had a change in the organization. New CTO comes in there and believes, hey, listen, I'm going to run with this particular system. You go full force for it, invest a lot of money into it, only for the users, intended users, to find it not working. Now you go back now and you go to respend. And sometimes I feel pain, you know, when I see what, you know, you have to actually charge. But I mean, it is what it is. Sometimes we pay our school fees for our mistakes. Yeah.
Indeed you do. That's the reality. I want to take 2 more questions if that's all right. There we go, there's one over there.
Thank you. I think one of our biggest challenges is how do you ensure that you don't lose your culture in a hybrid environment? Would somebody be able to speak to that?
Please, Washington. Yeah.
I think I'll give you from my experience as a people as managing a team. Is I think, you know, we talk about strategy and, you know, you talk about culture, right? Now, culture is a very big construct, right? Which you may need to break it down further. Because we talk about organizational culture, but how does then that culture then translate, if you're part of a multinational, for example, you know, the culture in South Africa may not necessarily be the same as in the US, but you want to talk about the organizational culture as well. So again, that flexibility becomes important. But more importantly, how do you then drive the culture within the organization? And sometimes you have to change the organizational culture. I mean, we've seen leaders being brought into companies to actually change the organization because you need to go in a different direction. So I believe that, you know, when you're thinking about that whole issue of culture, it's going to come back to a bigger construct, which is not, we talk about change management, but I think the bigger issue that you need to get the culture right is the change in leadership. Yeah. Because you need change in leadership. Change management is a process of now, this is how you do things and you change. But do you have the leadership? Do you have the right buy-in at the top level to then get that culture working? So a lot of the struggles are not necessarily because you've got the wrong culture, but is there that type of leadership that will drive the change?
Yeah. Interesting. I like that as a discussion. How do you keep the culture in a hybrid environment?
Yes. I wanted to add an experience that I had talking to a retailer. We helped them with a performance management system. And when it came to the employees at the store, one of the biggest questions that we needed to answer was, is the system not going to take away the sales agents' time away from customers? And that was something that was embedded in this customer's culture, you know, around, we want our salespeople to spend almost 80% of their time with the customers on the shop. Yes, they'll take a break, yes, they need to go on learning, yes, they need to attend meetings, but at the end of the day, they are here to come and serve customers. So that almost defines the minimum around which we are going to build and we are going to innovate as a business. So there's a minimum. When I brought up the culture conversation, maybe I made it sound like culture is homogeneous, but it differs sometimes within the same organization from team to team. There are going to be nuances, but there's a minimum which we are all measured as an organization, and that is driven by how we want to be known in the market as an organization. So, yeah, I just wanted to.
Great. All right, I'm going to grab one more question if I can from the floor. There we go. This is our last question.
My question is around AI is meant to automate what we do regularly as HR people. So one of the things that we good at as HR is to run surveys. We survey this or survey for that. So my comment first is that too much survey leads to survey fatigue. So with too much survey, the responses that you get, they tend to, the quality of responses tends to dwindle as you keep on doing it often. What can AI do in this space?
So I don't mind taking that question. So I do agree. I think there's a lot of survey fatigue that takes place. We see it on a consumer basis, definitely. But sometimes organizations work on doing a survey annually, then biannually. If you think about that perspective, you've had people that have left the organization, and then you have the data, and you're trying to fix something that's in the past. So my perspective is that most organizations need to work on the heartbeat of the employees. You've got to do it in real time. So some of the concepts that we work with is doing a rolling survey throughout the year. And I'll give you some examples of how we use the data. So we have a few questions that goes out globally to organizations every Friday. And it's pretty much, you do a click and it's a few sliding scale in terms of the questions, it's nicely animated. But on a Friday afternoon, globally, as a person that manages Workday South Africa and different business units globally, we have the heartbeat of our organization. And we can pick up the data based on diversity, based on pay, based on understanding trends. But it doesn't stop there, because you've got to do something with the data. And I think that's when the surveys become more powerful. When you respond to a survey and you know a few people aren't happy about something, or when management plays a role to take the leadership role, doing something about it, that's the next step. And our teams can actually take our survey data and show them on Friday and compare it to the other teams. So we can work out why is it that as a team, because this becomes now part of everyone's data, why is it that this team is happy about this and we are unhappy about why? We have those discussions. So it does come down to leadership in terms of addressing it head on. We had a scenario a few years ago, 2 years ago, where productivity level for our team went down. The survey data show that a lot of teams are unhappy with the office. So guess what? We used that to build a business case to change our office. We took their input in terms of what was required. We improved the company culture, improved our strategic position, and also productivity. So I think there's a way to get it right, but too much of surveying definitely leads to
Fantastic, love it.
Yeah. I think just to add, I think the surveys sometimes then give you the results that you don't want. Because people just keep answering the same question, because sometimes you're actually asking the wrong question and hoping for a different result.
You're absolutely right, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to bring back the augmentation conversation, that to avoid people becoming survey fatigue, we need to know what's happening in the employee's life cycle. So if I got a promotion, the system should not send out a survey to all the employees. How did you experience your promotion? It needs to be targeted to me. And a similar survey maybe will go to my manager, how did you experience the service from an HR perspective. But when we are able to make surveys bite-sized and we are able to target them to specific audiences in the workforce, then we get better output, which, like Washington said, we can then use to improve the organization.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to ask each of you to wrap this up very quickly. Our time is up. But I want to go back to the actual topic. I started off right in the beginning with you, Washington, and you spoke, are we doing the right things to prepare ourselves for 10 years' time? Give me a glimpse into the future. What does the future of HR look like in your eyes?
I think for me, the biggest thing is how do you make sure that your HR function remains aligned to the business strategy? Because we know that for now, and a lot of research shows that there's a misalignment between what your C-suite executive are prioritizing versus what HR is prioritizing. And how do you start to bring that together? I think where I see a lot of time being spent, you mentioned that change is constant, you're going to constantly be experiencing change. But how does HR take its rightful seat, at the table, to actually start driving the agenda or supporting the business strategy moving forward, as opposed to focusing on dealing with processes and procedures and everything else. So I see the future of it actually being, the people function really has to be at the forefront. What do you spend your time on becomes quite important. You cannot spend your time on analyzing a lot of the historical data, but what does that data tell you about the future? You've got to also be getting more and more into the future, being able to predict, and then assisting, for example, as a sales leader, what do I need to be thinking about from a people function? So how do you start bringing value to the table? What do I need to start thinking of? You're the CEO. What do you need to start thinking about this organization based on the strategy that you want to pursue? What does that mean for people that you have? So I see it going more about being more visionaries, the strategic foresight, and then bringing that back to then help the rest of your stakeholders consume the HR information.
Okay, Chikura?
Yeah, I think for me it's the skill that we need to develop as HR practitioners. There are skills that we were not expected to have in the past. Now there are skills that we need to have going forward. Things like business acumen. How do we measure the impact of the tools that we have deployed? What do we want to achieve? And how do we report that also in terms of rands and cents, right? Not only in terms of efficiency gains. The other thing that I want to talk about is people management. We spoke about the different generations at work. It's very common now to find mine managers, as an example, who are in their 30s, managing guys who are at the end of their careers. How do we enable those younger professionals to be able to carry out the people management function in a way that is beneficial, not only for the organization, but for their talent, that we can keep their talent going forward. And how do we craft and present HR information for someone like a line manager? What do they need from HR? When they do their staffing, when they look at their targets, how do they bring in HR information? And now this is the business acumen conversation. There's also an element of employee advocacy, right? When we speak about the EVP, many organizations have gotten customer advocacy, right? Listening to customers, responding, and bringing services to customers. And as HR, we need to start using some of those capabilities and tools that we have in our organization to begin to do employee advocacy.
Amazing. Kev, I'd like to final word with you.
Cool. So I think the key thing for me is that as we move into the future, 80% of the tasks that HR do is currently performing today is quite mundane, and that's where technology plays a role, especially with AI. So I see the future where, I think Dave already wrote it in 1996, the roles of HR, and Washington spoke about it. HR as practitioners or HR as a mindset of an organization needs to be more strategic, but the only way to do that is for the mundane tasks to be automated and move away. So hopefully by doing so, we can, one of our customers recently spoke about, we need to be able to run with the machines, leveraging technology to help us innovate, allowing our organizations to become more competitive. But to summarize for me, I do believe, and our organization believes, that happy employees does lead to happy customers, which has a direct impact on the growth and competitiveness of an organization.
Oh, it's so true. It really is. Washington, Kev, Chifiwa, thank you. Thank you so much for your insights into this discussion. Let's give them a round of applause, please.